Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. In this episode, I chat with Cait O'Connor, a 9th and 12th grade English teacher in upstate New York. Cait is also a mental health peer and fierce advocate who is heavily passionate about social justice, anti-racism, and anti-ableism. She also believes in combating weight bias and promoting size diversity and representation in the classroom and beyond. She can also identify all 50 capitals. During our conversation, we dive into the very uncomfortable topic of mental wellness. But Cait is quick to remind us that our discomfort is someone else's life. She points out that medical conditions have been commodified and that we are quick to use, or should I say misuse, commonly accepted labels while actively avoiding addressing these very real situations. In fact, Cait pushes back on widely accepted practices because they focus on the wellness aspect, but do not consider the illness behind the behaviors. Most of us approach wellness with a limited set of tools despite there existing a myriad of truths and experiences. Why don't we, she asks, embrace the same idea of differentiation for addressing wellness as we do with instruction? Cait insists that we need an overhaul and to really examine the educational settings and instructional practices that do not promote a safe environment for all students. We have done a lot of listening around this topic, but when will we start acting on it? Hello, Cait, and welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast. I am super excited to have you on. I know that you and I have not connected in other spaces, so this is our first time connecting, but you are going to bring to our listeners a topic that I think is critical for them to hear, for us to begin shifting our perceptions as we continue to counter the narrative. But before we jump into everything, Cait, please introduce yourself to our listeners. Share a little bit about what you do, how you got into education, and maybe something interesting about yourself.
Sure. I am a high school English teacher in the Hudson Valley area of New York, upstate. I got into teaching. I've always wanted to be a teacher. It was the first thing that I said that I wanted to do when I was a little kid. So it's something that's always been a career path that I was meant to follow. And I did, and I ended up, I'm from Long Island, but I ended up in the Hudson Valley where I went to undergrad, and I'm teaching there now. An interesting fact about me, I was thinking of this while I was, looking at my notes. Because of my avid sense of learning, I can actually still, to this day, ever since 4th grade, I can still name each capital city of the United States. So that's just an interesting fact about me. I have them memorized like on a card somewhere in the back of my mind file.
I was in my mind, I was like, you know what? I'm going to challenge her and I'm going to throw out a state. And then I realized, like, wait a minute, make sure if you do throw out a state that you know the capital before you challenge someone else. Well, Cait, again, as I mentioned, I'm super excited that you're on here because you are going to be discussing a topic with us that I think needs to be really discussed in depth, right?
Mhm.
We gloss over it, we kind of talk about it and say, yeah, this is important. But I'm hoping that as our listeners, join us in this conversation today, that they really begin to understand that there are levels and nuances and maybe aspects that we've never even thought about, never even considered before. And so I know you are going to talk about mental health, mental well-being, but even more so diving into some of the particulars, even with body image and eating disorders. And so, I want to open it up before I even ask my questions. If you could just kind of give us an insight into where you stand in the importance of this topic.
Yeah. So I've been a mental health advocate for a number of years. Certain aspects of that are close to my family, so it's been something that it's been really acutely um, aware for me. But I started really wondering a couple years ago how to sort of make this work that I do bleed into my career as a teacher, because when we talk about mental health, it's now this new popular thing. We talk about SEL and wellness, um, but we're still in a lot of ways deeply entrenched in stigma when it comes to mental health in the education field, right? Because, and I think that kind of comes down to the fact that mental health as a whole has not been destigmatized by our entire culture. It's just been commodified, right? So we have, we're being accepting, and we're learning, and we're listening about mental wellness and mental health. But no one's really talking about mental illness. We're always focused on the wellness part. We're not really there yet as far as getting into the really painful and scary pieces of what that looks like. We want to jump on the bandwagon as far as we want to talk about well-being, but the real thing that we need to focus on is that for people who experience these things, it can be really debilitating and scary. And you can't just say, meditate and it'll be over, right? That's a lot of what education is doing right now, is like they're focused on, depression and anxiety and mindfulness and meditation. And that's one dimension of an entirely like vast sense of what mental health and mental illness really are. So that comes down to we've commodified it, right? And we've decided to talk about only the acceptable and less scary pieces of it, especially in education. And that even in and of itself kind of has dimension to it too. We talk about it with respect to our students, but what about teachers? What about teachers who experience these things on a regular basis? Like, where is the support for them? And what are districts and admins doing to say, not just say it's okay to not be okay, but mean it. So that's been a lot of where I go with this kind of stuff, because it's really important to break down those, this is the socially acceptable part of mental health, and talk about, well, what about all of it?
Cait, it's weird listening to you say that, because I'm sitting here and reflecting, because not too long ago I was just on a panel with School Rubric, and that this is what we talked about, was mental wellness. And you're absolutely right. We shared our own tips on ways that we cope and we de-stress, and we try to balance our mental wellness. But those things, I think, as you said, work great if you're kind of doing okay already,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if you're really struggling with an issue, right, just saying, well, I'm just going to disconnect, right, or I'm going to, like you said, meditate, it's not going to really target the heart of that issue. And so I'm really glad and humbled the fact that you're bringing this up, because while yes, those things are important and we're trying to do our part, there is so much more. This is so much bigger. And I didn't even consider the idea of focusing on wellness and not the illness. And so I guess my question for you is, what are some of the ways have you actively helped to change this narrative and really bring enlightenment to educators, to students, to whomever, around the need to really focus on the illness part of this as well?
I think the best thing that educators can do is really get in front of it. I was asked at a school that I worked at to talk to students about my experiences um, with mental health and, with my own stuff that I had going on. And kids would ask questions that were so nuanced and so important, and were given information, right, that health class didn't teach them, because there was a peer standing in front of them giving them, this is my experience, this is my story. I always tell my students there are, as many truths as there are people on this planet, right? So someone who has whatever diagnosis might have a completely different experience than someone else with that same diagnosis, right? So we have to understand that peer work is the essence of how we get around understanding these things. But also, it asks us to sort of confront our own bias with, okay, well, we're doing that thing in our culture right now where it's just like, well, maybe you should just, if you're depressed, maybe you should just go outside, or maybe you could just take a shower, right? Mindfulness is kind of that thing for people with mental illness, because it's like, if you just meditate, you'll feel better. And it doesn't take into account that, meditating is one thing, right? It absolutely, mindfulness changes the brain. There's no doubt about that. There's endless studies that prove that's true. But what about, therapy and talking and having a support network and taking medication? Why aren't we normalizing those things? Because those are the other, parts of the fraction that matter, right? We can't just meditate and that's our medicine. We have to have supportive people who are going to tell us, like, it's okay that you're not okay right now. And, like you said, you mentioned, like, those tools work for people who are already okay, right? Who don't necessarily have a diagnosable mental health concern. And that in and of itself speaks volumes, right? Yeah, of course it works for neurotypical people, because once the meditation's over, they're not, still stuck in their head with faulty chemicals. So it's a lot more than commercialized ideas of mental wellness are making it out to be. And I think education really needs to acknowledge that if they actually want to help people and, put their money where their SEL is, really.
I like that one.
Mm-hmm.
Cait, I have to ask. Earlier, you and I were chatting, and like I told you, I wish I would have hit record then. But you're right. Like, as educators, as schools, we want to do what's best for our students, and we try, right? Or we do what we think is best.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some things that we may be doing that we don't even realize that we're contributing to these very real issues that students are experiencing?
Yeah. So the thing about mindfulness, especially, and I go back to this a lot because it's a thing that, we act like is universal, but is not, right? So when we think about the strategies that we're using to deal with mental health in our schools, right, we talk about the multidimensional aspects of it, right? So, for example, mindfulness might impact certain kids differently. If they have trauma, it's going to be really difficult for them to sit in silence because they're worried about what's going to happen to their body, right? That's their hyper focus. So we need tools that are as malleable and as scaffolded as our instruction when it comes to mental health and wellness and mindfulness. But, generally speaking, teachers and students alike need better conditions that are less traumatic and overwhelming, right? We need to stop compliance-based strategy, racism, classism, ableism, citizenship discrimination, fat phobia. Like, those are all forms of trauma that transcend school buildings, right? So if kids didn't have traumatic events occurring based on their identities, maybe mental health wouldn't be as prevalent as it is right now, because kids are constantly being traumatized by their environment. And that's a function of, why we're here. So teachers too, there's plenty of, teaching itself is 80% white and predominantly women. And, we can't act like racism and sexism don't have a hand in that. So creating less traumatic conditions is ultimately, it sounds like the simple answer or like pointing out the obvious, but it's the necessary work that is not getting done um, at all times. We're putting a Band-Aid on it. Mindfulness is our Band-Aid, but we need an overhaul. We don't need a Band-Aid. And that's where mental health, but that's the state of mental health right now in education, ultimately, is fix the conditions, not,
no, no, absolutely. So I have to ask you this then. When you are doing this work, right, when you are attempting to overhaul this, when you are attempting to really dismantle, what are many of the obstacles that you see? Because as you said, this seems simple, right? This seems like this is just really like common sense, and yet we're not there. So what are some of the obstacles or the pushback that you've experienced as you've tried to do this work?
I personally haven't, been told like this is not what we're doing. But just as general observations, like obviously, a lot of what occurs when this work is getting done and someone doesn't like it, that's a function of just, generally like white fragility. A lot of different maintenances of dominant narrative, of status quo, right? Because if you try to go beyond, like I said, in the mental health arena, if you try to go beyond depression and anxiety, and you start talking about bipolar disorder, personality disorders, OCD, eating disorders, right? Immediately, those are like the umbrella that fits under the word crazy, right? People are like, oh no, that person's crazy, right? And it's interesting because I hear students do this, I even hear adults do this, but like they start using those diagnoses that they don't think are acceptable as um as verbs and adjectives, right? Like, oh, when you say like, oh, she's so bipolar, right? Or like, oh, I have OCD, like I have to have my classroom be like a certain way, and it's like, no, you're just particular, right? So even in our language, right, we deem people with those actual humans with those diagnoses as crazy, but then we want to use the language and co-opt it when we're talking about something, and that creates that dissonance between we view those people as crazy and they're unacceptable in our sphere. So how can we invite them in because they don't belong? So when we're creating spaces where this stuff matters, language has a lot to do with it. Disrupting dominant narratives has a lot to do with it. And, just being willing to listen has a lot to do with it, right? Because, and I'll say that carefully, because when you're listening, a lot of people have treated that as a passive verb, um, especially in the past year or so, right? With, the critical race theory coming to the forefront with George Floyd's death, people saying, I'm listening. And it's like, okay, well, listening is great and it needs to happen. But after a while, what are you doing with that listening? Are you acting on that listening, right? Don't use listening as a cop out for saying, I don't know enough yet, so I can't act, right? You can always act on injustice and always act on destigmatizing mental health, whether or not you have 110% of the information, because no one on earth has 110% of the information needed in order to proceed forward, including me, right? Like I don't act like an expert on this stuff. Like I'm constantly learning. But if I waited for the right time, and I just put that in air quotes, over here, if I waited for the right time to speak up and do something, nothing would ever happen and nothing would ever change to help people in real time do the right thing and, actually assist others with mental health concerns. So I think that's a lot of it is, we're waiting for the right time until we know all of it. And that's impeding our ability to progress.
I was just having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and that was exactly the thing that we talked about, was this idea of people wanting to be absolutely ready, right, before you start. And, I kind of said that there's this thin line between procrastination and preparation, right? It's just sitting there like, no, I have to be ready. And so you're absolutely right. So I guess my question is, and I hope, right, to the listeners out there right now, that you are as feeling as uncomfortable as I am right now. Because as Cait is sharing this information, I cannot help but reflect and think about what are some of the ways that I have, involuntarily, unconsciously contributed to some of these things, right? This idea that you mentioned, like, oh, somebody who's truly experiencing these situations, and we are so quick to call them crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we apply them to ourselves in an attempt to justify, our own behaviors. Like it's Cait, I so wish that we would have connected earlier.
Yeah.
So
And,
go ahead.
it comes down to, like, I'm thinking as you just spoke, and that's, you just caught me. I'm guilty of that too. We're often listening to reply and not listening to listen. And that's something that we can't do when it comes to conversations of, race, gender, mental health, whatever, right, the case might be in terms of social justice. We can't listen to reply. We need to listen because lives depend on that. But, I'm thinking about with the action versus like the learning process, like no one ever can read a book for 23 of 24 hours a day, right? So like in the process of your learning and you're getting ready and your prep to do the work, right? Because reading is the work, but you can't be reading a book 24 hours a day on how to fix the problem, right? So in between putting the book down, are you writing to your legislators? Are you having a conversation with someone who disagrees with you? Right? Because that's a marker for that too, is we often have these conversations in bubbles where people who already have the information that we do, or might have a sense of the information that we do, are in the conversation. But are you actively engaging with people who aren't where you are? That's a marker of, are you ready to do this work, right? Are you ready to destigmatize rather than just commodify and co-opt and talk about and run a workshop on it after you've read a single book about it? So it's a matter of what we do with the work, as opposed to sitting in isolation among ourselves and like-minded people, that really can make or break actual tangible change occurring.
I know that there are going to be some Twitter people who absolutely disagree with that last statement,
Yeah.
but you make absolute sense. We find ourselves in these comfort bubbles, right? Like, hey, everybody thinks the same, and we're going to have the same conversation, and it feels like we're making progress because it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, you're preaching to the choir,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and so, like you said, I'm super glad that I was able to step outside of my little bubble and connect with you here, because the information that you are sharing is profound and probably something that I would not have stumbled upon had I stayed within my close group and said, okay, well, we're all going to be experts in X, Y, and Z, right? Yet there's the rest of the alphabet out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, that's a challenge to people to then, okay, like look at your district's wellness policies and look at your district's wellness professional development and ask, why aren't we being given information about the other 18 disorders that are common among our students and our staff? Why are our desks set up the way that they are to foster compliance among our kids rather than actual collaborative learning? So there are certain ways in which PDs are great, but they deliver information that I can go on Psychology Today and read at home. They don't transform in ways that need to happen for our kids and for ourselves and for each other. Because when we go back to our school building, the morning after the PD that we went to that night, are we still using words like bipolar and OCD when we don't mean them? Are we still, assuming that our kids are just non-compliant rather than they might have a mental health concern? We need to do and go above and beyond our PDs and our wellness policies and our mindfulness strategies and really reach into the community and sort of try to understand what's going on and just say okay rather than say I know.
So, Kate, I have to ask, what if there's an educator out there, and I'm sure there are because I'm thinking this myself. If there was one thing, right? And we often talk about not being overwhelmed and trying to take on way too much.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was one thing, if you were to have your I don't know, maybe top three, so they could choose from one, something that I can go back into my classroom and begin working on this, right? Not just being a listener, not just reading a book, but actively trying to dismantle this as we've talked about. Do you have any like one thing that I can do as an educator that I can go back and do right now?
I'm gonna go really rogue right now and say, and I'm gonna explain this, right? So there's an aside here. Let the kids run the room. And what I mean by that is community agreements rather than rules go an insanely long way, right? Because when I start a year, anywhere, any school, community agreements are where we begin. And it allows students to have a sense of not only what they expect, but show you who they are, right? So if you have kids who might, be anxious, maybe they'll throw out there, okay, I value, this kind of assignment, or I value this kind of communication style. That's letting them show you who they are and informing how they want to have a learning experience, right? And that's ultimately what we're teachers for, is designing learning experiences based on who's in front of us, not based on what we think or what we learned in undergrad or what we know or our perception of the world, right? And that can change year to year, which is why every year those community agreements that I start with my students are completely different than the year before or even semester before, right? And they're always adapting and always changing, and being amended the same way that students are always adapting and changing and amending. Especially in high school. I teach ninth grade right now, and who they are right now is going to be completely different than who they are in 6 months, in 3 weeks, in 4 years. Um, so understanding that people can change and people are malleable, is a significant skill, that we need to have as educators, especially right now in the middle of a pandemic. The less we can make people anxious, the better. But why not include that in your regular instruction beyond just pandemic time?
That's perfect. This idea that we should not just be doing this now because, right? This has to become normalized. And you mentioned that earlier. If we normalize this, if we destigmatize this, right, then we could really begin to address the actual issues and not just, it's not just a fad. It's not just something we're talking about because it's right at the forefront or it's the buzzword. Like, because at the end of the day, when all of this fades away, like mental illness isn't going anywhere.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. And that's the thing is I saw, as far as the pandemic goes, I've been seeing this phrase thrown around a lot, like compassion, not compliance. Where was that energy before March 13th when everything closed?
Mm-hmm.
And I think teachers are doing that because they don't want to be overwhelmed right now. And I get that, but like the kids don't want to be either. And they've never wanted to be overwhelmed. Right. So instead of teaching them to comply, right, and to follow rules and regulations, why not teach them to create their experience and their reality? And right, to understand that, even after everybody's okay again, it's still going to be okay not to be okay. Right. So this idea that, you know, everybody's anxious right now and it's normal to be anxious right now and talk about how not okay we are because of the conditions outside, right? That energy needs to maintain after everyone's vaccinated and this all escapes us, right? Because there are still going to be people out there with anxiety. There's still going to be people out there with depression and bipolar disorder and eating disorders, and they need acknowledgement just like they needed it before. And it's still going to be all right to say, I'm not okay right now and I need some help.
Cait, there is so much that I hope our listeners are able to take away from this conversation. It has been an amazing conversation, and one that I hope that you and I can continue, off the air and in other spaces.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure people want to know, how can I get in touch with you? Because I want to learn more. I want to know more. I want to do more. So can you share with the listeners, how can they find you? What spaces are you in?
Absolutely. I'm a huge Twitter person. I love Twitter. I'm in like a million Twitter chats a week, which is probably not good for my mental health, but it keeps me going. It keeps me energized. It keeps me informed. So that's why I do it. But mostly on Twitter, at Just Teaching ELA is my handle. And I can be reached on Twitter anytime. My DMs are open. If anyone has any questions, anything they want to talk about, I'm here.
Okay, I cannot thank you enough. I mean, obviously for coming on the show and sharing with everyone this amount of knowledge and insight. I think if there's a listener who hasn't shifted or changed or even questioned their own participation in this, they really have to do a deeper reflection, because I've tried really hard during the show to be a host and a student, which is not always the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
But so thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And just thank you for the amazing work that you continue to do, both in your school and in the educational space as a whole. I cannot thank you enough, but I will try. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you are hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe. The show can be found on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and several of your other favorite platforms. This podcast is also featured on schoolrubric.com, where you can find educational articles, videos, and interviews with educators from around the globe. Be sure to connect with the host and other listeners by following the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and joining the show's Facebook group. Take care.